3 Phases of Persecution, a tool for context analysis. There's no international consensus on how to define or measure persecution on the basis of religion or belief. This means that different statistics on persecuted groups can be confusing, hard to compare, or even misleading. However, one aspect of persecution seems to be constant in all the definitions and measurements, namely direct violence or the threat of violence. One useful way to describe the mechanisms involved in moving towards violence and threats is Johan Candelin's 3-phase model. The model identifies 3 phases which build upon each other: disinformation, discrimination, and violent persecution. The first phase is disinformation. In this phase, prejudices, stereotypes and lies are spread in the media and social media, through educational materials like school textbooks, and through the way politicians and officials describe religious minorities. This disinformation builds up a culture of intolerance, prejudice and tension between groups in society. And once this culture has gained a foothold, it becomes easy for the government and people in the general population to justify discriminatory actions. Disinformation enables discrimination to become legitimate in people's minds. In the second phase, we see not only disinformation, but discrimination too. Discrimination affects people in every area of life. Sometimes the state has discriminatory legislation, for example, different rules for different groups when it comes to building places of worship. Religiously based family and personal identity law can also have discriminatory elements, such as bans on leaving the majority religion and on interreligious marriages. Discrimination in the way the law is implemented is also commonplace. For example, when police refuse to document or investigate crimes committed against people from religious minorities. There can also be discrimination in the provision of services, like education and health. For example, if teachers and doctors treat students and patients differently, depending on their religion or belief. It's also common to find a lower level of investment in infrastructure and public services in minority areas. And of course, discrimination occurs in daily life, in the private sector and the social sphere, and affects people's access to employment and housing, for example. So disinformation creates a culture of intolerance, which leads people to accept, justify and engage in discrimination. And if left unchecked, disinformation and discrimination together build up a basis for direct violence. When the state, individuals or groups in society begin to justify threats and violence towards people on the basis of their religious or belief identity, we've moved into the third phase: violence. On top of disinformation and discrimination, we begin to see harassment, which develops into threats and then into physical violence. This violence could be targeted towards a person, a group, or their belongings, for example in the form of beatings, killings, and mob attacks. Other examples of violence are arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and displacement. This violence can take place at different levels of intensity. There can be sporadic incidents of violence towards individuals by individuals, such as hate crimes, kidnapping, and forced marriage. There can also be mass violence, such as mob attacks, or religiously motivated terror attacks on whole communities. In the same way, state violence can be directed at specific individuals who in some way represent the community, like religious leaders, or full-scale military attacks. At its worst, violence develops into genocide. Another question we need to ask ourselves is what role the state plays in disinformation, discrimination, and violence. Is it actively contributing to any of these, for example through hate speech, discriminatory legislation, or imprisonments? Or is it passive, doing little or nothing to stop disinformation, discrimination and violence by non-state actors in society. It's hard to say at what point disinformation, discrimination and violence taken together qualify as violent persecution. What we can say is that persecution involves systematic disinformation, discrimination and violence. This three-phase model is a really helpful tool for doing a basic context analysis. For each of the phases we can ask, what examples of this can we see in our context? And for each example you find, you can answer the following questions. Who is committing the wrongdoing? Is the state active or passive? Who is the victim? Are they male or female? What religion or belief do they have? And what socioeconomic status? Do any other religious or belief groups suffer from the same restrictions and violations? Are there factors other than religion behind the problems? For example, economic interests, ethnicity, class, or climate change? What dimensions of freedom of religion or belief are being violated? And what other human rights are being violated? Using this model and these questions, you can put together a basic context analysis that will help you understand your context more fully and grasp how the different elements of disinformation, discrimination and violence are interlinked.